We may have some stragglers that come in, but I'm really excited to welcome you to our another Hungry for History lecture. Today we're going to be talking about Tomochichi, and we've got Dr. Robin Williams here with us from SCAD, and I want to give you a little background on Robin. Dr. Williams is the chair of the Architectural History Department at Savannah College of Art and Design, where he specializes in the history of modern architecture and cities in Europe and North America. He earned his PhD in art history at the University of Pennsylvania with a dissertation on the urban transformation of 19th century Rome. Since he joined SCAD in 1993, Williams has focused his research on Savannah. He directed the online virtual historic Savannah project from 1997 through 2006, and he was the lead author on a new guidebook, Buildings of Savannah, and he brought his copy. We also have a copy in the city's library and archives for city employees to check out if you'd like to see a copy. His current research analyzes the evolution of street and sidewalk pavement in cities across the USA, and he's done a lot of research on Savannah's historic pavement, which is really fascinating. So you might want to talk to him about that. And I think you've got some upcoming lectures you might want to mention to them.
Yes. All done?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was turning it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Luciana, and thank you for the invitation to have me here and present to all of you. So this Friday, I'm doing a talk. Every quarter at SCAD, I do a talk called Discover Savannah, which is mainly for the freshman students to learn about the city that they're moving into. But it's open to the public, and it'll be, as I say, I do it every quarter, so this will be about the 12th time that I've done this talk. So it's very popular, and it's in the SCAD Museum of Art Theater at 10 a.m. So if you are interested, feel free to show up, and Friday morning at 10. Today, however, I'm doing this presentation, this is what I need, about Tomochichi, who is someone who's grown out of my interest in Savannah Squares and urban planning. And as I worked on the squares, obviously there are many monuments in the Savannah Squares, particularly this unique one dedicated to Tomochichi. And it was actually partway into the talk, we'll see this mound, that short-lived mound that existed in Wright Square that has often been mistaken as the burial mound of Tomochichi, which it was not. And through the course of my research, I discovered that Tomochichi actually makes appearances in Savannah history multiple times and has been celebrated in a wide variety of ways. But he also is typical of Native Americans who have seen their fortunes rise and fall as American politics have dictated that Native Americans are a positive presence in our country, or are they a threat and a nuisance or an impediment to the development of the country. So early on, Tomochichi was celebrated by Oglethorpe, then in fact had a monument. And then over time, his status declined like those of Native Americans. And eventually he was lost to the, as they say, the sands of time. He was completely forgotten until the late 19th century when his star started rising again, which led ultimately to this monument and others like this one, which many of you probably have never seen, that's in the old Arnold High School on Bull Street. Now SCAD's Arnold Hall has this wonderful painting over the theater. So Oglethorpe, when he arrived, the narrative of Georgia history has Tomochichi playing a central role in that arrival scene. In fact, it's celebrated on a US stamp from many years ago. The landing of Oglethorpe doesn't mention Tomochichi, but there he is over to the right. And Oglethorpe had a very different experience from other English settlers in that Tomochichi welcomed the English. He was excited by the arrival of the English and helped negotiate treaties for Oglethorpe upon their arrival and settlement, whereas in other colonies up and down the East Coast, the friction with the natives would lead to wars, like in Florida, the Seminole Wars, fights in Massachusetts and Virginia against the natives. But in Georgia, the experience was very, very different, and it owed a lot to Tomochichi, who was very diplomatic, and to the point where Oglethorpe recognized that he had not only an ally in Tomochichi, but someone who he honored really as a head of state and respected the importance of the Indian presence, the Native American presence. So when the plan, the Oglethorpe plan, the large land use plan for the region, was developed with the town in the blue at the center there, the yellow are the garden lots, green are the farm lots, and then these forest concessions that march out into the countryside. This vast plan of Oglethorpe's made allowance for land, you can see circled in red, for the Native Americans. So there was a place for them within this larger vision. Tomochichi had his portrait painted, and this is a later print after that painting by Willem Verelst when he went to England. Oglethorpe took Tomochichi, his nephew, his wife, and a few others over to England in 1734 for what essentially was a state visit. And for a Native American to be treated like a head of state, to be presented not only to the Georgia trustees, also documented in a painting, but that he was presented to Parliament, he met the King and Queen of England, and he also met the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the kind of people who could have those kind of meetings essentially is like a state leader. And so Tomochichi had this significance that I'm not aware of any other native being accorded, especially back in the 18th century. Upon his death in 1739, Tomochichi was written about in one of the early magazines, as we understand what a magazine is. In fact, comes from a publication like this one, the Gentleman's Magazine, one of the first to make this new use of the word magazine, a periodical that appeared monthly in London. This is the March 1740 issue, so about 6 months after the death of Tomochichi, which I suppose news clearly didn't travel as quickly as it does today. And so this was considered news, this death from the previous year of who they called King Tomochichi. And there was an article about his funeral, and the funeral was orchestrated by none other than Oglethorpe himself. And Oglethorpe essentially organized a state funeral for Tomochichi, who had requested at the time of his death that he be buried in the town rather than in his traditional native lands outside the city. He wanted to be buried in the town, so Oglethorpe chose a site in the center of what today is Wright Square. Even though there was a burial ground at the time overlooking Wright Square, essentially just beside where the Wright Square Chocolatier is today, were two lots, and there's a plaque on that site that marks that that was the first burial ground in Savannah. Well, he wasn't buried there. He could have been, but he wasn't. Nor was he buried out anywhere in the common, but rather in a site right in the middle of the square, and a monument was erected over his site. But before we get to that, I wanted to comment that at the time there was at this funeral, this remarkable military honors funeral, one commentator noted that at the depositing of the corpse, 7 minute guns were fired, and about 40 men in arms, as many as could instantly be found, gave their volleys over the grave. So if you can imagine, like when a military leader dies and you have the formal state funeral and you have the people shooting the rounds, the volleys, that's the kind of funeral he had, and that it was international news. It got attention in London in that Gentleman's Magazine. So at the time, Savannah had the 6 squares. The urban plan of Savannah was limited to the 6 wards we are in City Hall down at the bottom near Johnson Square. So this was aligned with Bull Street, or turning it around, this is what Savannah looked like at the time in 1739. So Oglethorpe's decision to erect a monument, which was characterized as a pyramid of stone and may have looked like this monument to General Wolfe that came a few years later, a mid-18th century monument to a military figure. And it was at a time that the squares of Savannah, we look back on the squares of Savannah, and often historians say, well, the squares are simply utilitarian spaces meant to originally quarter soldiers. They would eventually have streetcar tracks running through them. One square had a water tower. And so there was a perception later in history that the squares were strictly utilitarian spaces. Well, I would argue that the funeral of King Tomochichi, and here's a further account of that in that magazine, and the decision of Oglethorpe to bury him in Wright Square, right in the middle, is, along with the erection of a sundial in the middle of Johnson Square, evidence that Oglethorpe thought of these squares as something grander than just simple utilitarian spaces, that these were urban spaces, these were formalized space. And in fact, here is a detail of that map. What we've been looking at, by the way, is the de Bram map of 1757 of Savannah, which is one of the highest detailed early maps. It even shows that there was a wall of some construction, probably a wooden palisade around the city at the time. And the tomb at the time was described as a pyramid of stone, that it had local, essentially, characterized as a kind of obelisk, in that Oglethorpe was described, that mentioned that Oglethorpe intends to dignify with some obelisk or the like over the tomb of Tomochichi, a memorial to the Indians, how great regard the English would pay to all their nations who maintain true friendship with us. So, in other words, one commentator recognized that by erecting this tomb to the Native American chief, it was a kind of sign of conciliation, of ally building, of fostering good relations with people they needed for the success of their growing empire. So it may have been as much an honorific thing as it was perhaps a political gesture. But nonetheless, what ended up being initially conceived of as an obelisk evolved into what was described as a pyramid of stone, and it was constructed of what were described as ironstones. And ironstones, I'm not quite sure, I wasn't aware that there would be stones indigenous to the Savannah area, but apparently they collected what they could find in terms of local stones, and this is the only picture I've been able to find of an ironstone. So it's probably a pile of stones in the form of a pyramid, probably more natural than carved. And unfortunately, this monument doesn't survive, obviously, and so we don't know, nor was it ever documented, apart from this quite precise drawing on this map that shows it at roughly, if this is an engineer's map, so we assume it's to scale, it would roughly be, say, about 20 feet across at the base, so maybe 15 feet tall if it's a typical pyramid. Now, the idea of putting a monument in the center of a square is an idea that had emerged in the Renaissance after years of squares not having monuments in their center through the Middle Ages. Michelangelo's decision to put a monument in the center of the Piazza del Campidoglio, or the Capitoline Square in Rome, is the beginning of this tradition, which then spreads to London, where in the 1680s, after the restoration of Charles II, a statue to him was erected in the middle of Soho Square. It later was taken down, and this strange Tudor-looking building was erected in the center of the square instead. But then, years later, the monument made a return journey back to Soho Square. But this idea of erecting a monument in a prominent place and having a finished kind of formal monument arrives in America in the 1770s. So the earliest public monuments in America essentially are things like this statue to William Pitt that was at the center of two streets, Meeting and Broad Street, literally in the middle of what they have sometimes called the Charleston Square, right in the middle of the street. And so these have historically been understood. This one, along with a monument to King George III that was in the Bowling Green in Lower Manhattan, were also erected in 1770, have long been thought to be the earliest public monuments in America. But if that pyramid of stone in the center of a square, just like these were, is considered a monument, and it's 21 years later, it's 31 years later, sorry, get my math straight, 1739, yes, 31 years later, and would be the earliest public monument in America. If we can call it a monument, and if it indeed existed as a pyramid of stone or an obelisk. So what happened to that monument, and why might it have disappeared? Well, during the second half of the 18th century, within a generation of the monument to Tomochichi being erected, the French and Indian Wars, or the 7 Years' War, depending on what you want to call it, saw different native tribes supporting the British versus supporting the French, and antagonism towards at least some natives started growing during this period. Also, it was during this period that the British drew a line through the Appalachians, marking the western boundary that the colonists could go. Even though colonists wanted to push on west, but the native reserve that the British had defined in 1763 was seen by many as a kind of an impediment to westward growth. With the American Revolution and finally in 1783, the United States signs a peace treaty with the British and they get control over these lands, this line will be erased and American development will start pushing west into those so-called Indian lands. Well, part of those Indian lands included North Georgia, where in the late 1820s they discovered gold, the first big gold rush in American history. And if you have gold, you're going to want to claim title to that land. But this land, unfortunately, was Cherokee land in North Georgia. And so, starting with Andrew Jackson, there was a series of expulsions of Native Americans in the early 1830s, pushing the Seminole out of Florida, the Cherokee and the Creek out of Georgia and Alabama, and the Chickasaw and Choctaw out of Mississippi to these, as well as other tribes from farther north, into these native reserves in Arkansas and Oklahoma. It's often referred to as the Trail of Tears because these mass expulsions were rather brutally handled. And so in Georgia, we have the expulsions of the Cherokee. And meanwhile, in Florida, the Seminole did not go quietly. And in fact, a war erupted. The Second Seminole War erupted in 1835. And in that context, a rather entrepreneurial man named James R. Butts of Macon, Georgia, offered the use of his so-called large and commodious steamboat, the Tomochichi, to the Georgia Governor William Schley at the time for transporting troops and supplies from Darien, Georgia to Florida to help fight the Seminole. And I wonder if anyone saw the irony in offering a ship named after a native to carry troops down to fight natives. But that's what it was. This is not the Tomochichi per se, but this is the kind of steamboat that would have been from that era. So around that time, the mid-1830s, Savannah was documented in this amazing painting that's over at the Georgia Historical Society, the famous Cerveau view of Savannah. And it shows actually a view from the site of this building, the old City Exchange, looking south up Bull Street with Bay Street in the foreground. And it is fastidiously detailed. It's an amazing document. So if we zoom in on Bull Street and we see Johnson Square with the green monument designed by William Strickland, and you can see the old fences, the paths, and troops, and the dirt roads with their tracks from the horses and buggies, and the various buildings that existed, including Independent Presbyterian Church, and the Juliet Gordon Low Birthplace House, the Judge James Moore Wayne House, and the pumps that were on Bull Street. But if we really zoom in to where Wright Square would have been, we assume that it was there, and there is no evidence of this monument to Tomochichi. It's gone. So that map of 1757 is the only document we have, that, as well as one reference to Wright Square and this Tomochichi monument existing. So 2 documents, one textual, one map document, but by 1837, 80 years later, it's gone. So if we look ahead, at what point does Tomochichi start re-emerging into the narrative of history? So through most of the 19th century, there's no mention of Tomochichi apart from that steamboat in the 1830s. Why this fellow in Macon would name his boat after Tomochichi is not known. But 1859, Constantino Brumidi designed the big frieze of American history that's inside the Capitol Building dome in Washington. It's an enormous frieze that wraps around the whole inside of the dome. And one of the scenes of American history is Oglethorpe and the Indians. And so here you see Oglethorpe sitting down and the natives sort of welcoming him. And, but what's interesting is there's no mention in the notes or the design of Tomochichi, just that Oglethorpe met some Indians. And confirmation of this obscurity of Tomochichi's existence finally becomes apparent when a native Savannian who had moved to New York, Charles C. Jones, wrote the historical sketch of Tomochichi, Miko of the Yamacraw, a biography. And he says in his introduction, and he laments rather, that more than a century a quarter has elapsed since those funeral honors were paid, and even the precise spot where the Indian chief was interred has passed from the recollection of the thousands who throng the streets and loiter among the parks of the beautiful city of Savannah. Neither street nor public square perpetuates his name, and his memory scarce lives in occasional remembrance. This should not be. So he wrote this biography to help restore the reputation of Tomochichi, and it's a turning point. And quite by coincidence, a few years later, in 1872, appears a mound on Bull Street. And this mound is one of several that actually, so there's the mound on Wright Square, there was a mound in Madison Square, and there was even a mound in Oglethorpe Square, although this one was in the corner and was privately erected. The other two were erected by the city. Now, let's go back for a second and think, why on earth would the city erect mounds in the middle of squares? And this is something that's really puzzled me for a long time. But a separate research project that I was working on in terms of the history of the squares, in December 1871, a streetcar company owner petitioned the city to allow streetcar tracks to pass through the squares of Savannah. And the city said, no, we don't want streetcar tracks going through our squares. But the streetcar company lawyers argued, well, the squares are utilitarian. When they were founded, they were utilitarian. So this is that point where I was mentioning they pointed to the documents that said the squares were intended to allow soldiers to be quartered, animals to graze in times of a siege. They'd have wells and cisterns. But what they overlooked in their argument was the fact that Oglethorpe had also formalized those squares with the sundial and the monument to Tomochichi, and recognized and said that they should be places of recreation. So that court case ended up in the Georgia Supreme Court. And if you know anything about the history of Savannah Squares, streetcar tracks did in fact go through the squares, 13 of them in fact by the late 19th century. The decision of the Supreme Court was in late December 1871. In mid-January 1872, 3 weeks later, City Council, and this in the predecessor to this building, passed an ordinance presented by James Farrell, who was an alderman at the time, who advocated the building of 5 mounds in different squares, 2 of which were built on Bull Street. And it occurred to me when I took these 2 separate research issues, the streetcar tracks and these mounds, and realized they were only 3 weeks apart. And so what I suspect happened is what the city did after it lost the court case was, okay, how can we stop tracks from going through the squares? Let's build piles of rock. And so the one in Madison Square clearly looks like a pile of rock. The one in in Wright Square was overgrown with, maybe that's jasmine or something. But on every one of them, they put a Warwick vase, which is an elegant, I'll come back to that photo in a minute, which is an elegant vase. The one in Madison Square is now in the garden of the Green Meldrum House. There are also 2 Warwick vases just down Bay Street over here by the old top of the City Exchange. I'm not sure if they're from the other mounds So I know of 3 of these vases. And a Warwick vase was famous in the 18th century as this ancient vase that was discovered from ancient Rome. It was in the collection of an antiquarian in Rome, and copies in cast iron were made of it throughout the Western world. They were a very popular garden item. So Savannah had 3 of them, and they put these, it looks like a century plant, emerging from the top of what I assume is a pile of rock. So if you want to stop a streetcar track from going through a square, build a big pile of stone, evidently. So, but if you go to, now I've been trying to figure out the mounds and is there an English garden tradition? And this is the best I could come up with. Someone mentioned to me, oh yeah, there are mounds in English gardens, but it's not quite the same thing. They don't have vases. So what I think happened, going back to these pictures, is that they could justify these as monuments. 3 squares at the time had monuments. Well, Johnson Square and Monterey Square had monuments by this time. Chippewa had a big fountain, but Madison and Wright Squares were open. And I'm sure the city was nervous that streetcar tracks would navigate their way onto Bull Street. So these mounds evidently worked. The streetcar companies got a quick start on Barnard Street and eventually went up Abercorn Street as well. And so the mounds successfully kept the streetcar tracks off Bull. And ironically, streetcar tracks did go through Oglethorpe Square. But this mound, as I mentioned, was privately developed by a person who lived across the street. But it also has a smaller version of a vase on the top. And it's possible that 2 other mounds were erected in other squares. There's a reference to one in Albert Square on Montgomery Street in a document. But when these mounds were torn down, the one in Wright Square was torn down in 1883 to make room for the Gordon Monument, there was no mention in the paper, oh, the burial mound of Tomochichi is being torn down. They didn't reference it as that. They simply called it the mound. And it was being torn down. It was only 10 years old. If you go to Wikipedia and read about Tomochichi, it will tell you that the Gordon Monument desecrated the burial site of Tomochichi because it led to the destruction of his burial mound. Well, the mound was torn down, yes, to make room for the monument, but the mound was there. It was evidently a municipal strategy to stop streetcar tracks. It had nothing to do with Tomochichi. It just coincidentally was a mound. In the 1850s, starting in the 1850s, tobacconists started tobacco shops. So in the 1850s, we see evidence of an attitude towards Native Americans beginning to warm nationally. But it's a kind of a generic Native American, a Native American chief, not a specific Native American, just these sort of generic chiefs. And the context would be tobacconist shops would have a statue, a wooden statue, life-size statue of a Native American chief holding the tobacco because it was from the natives that Europeans got tobacco. So this became a popular selling point for tobacconists in the from 1850s to the 1880s. So it's showing a warming of attitudes towards these. And I realized that the version of my PowerPoint that I'm showing is not the one I'm meant to show. I'm seeing all these edits I did this morning. It's like, uh-oh, I've uploaded the wrong PowerPoint. So I'll improvise. I was going to show you the Indian head penny, which came into circulation in 1859. So a couple years after these guys started appearing, pennies in America from 1859 to 1909, the US penny had a similar Indian chief with a profile with a headdress of feathers on the US penny. Again, very generic, but again, showing fascination with Native Americans. At the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, there were Native Americans, living Native Americans, were put on display as an anthropological exhibit and say, look at these fascinating people from our heritage. And so Americans began, at the time of their centennial, recognizing, well, what defines us as Americans? And so the iconography of Native Americans begins to play a part. And it's in that context that we begin to see Tomochichi reemerging from obscurity after Jones's biography on the occasion of the sesquicentennial of Savannah, the 150th anniversary, they find an actor to perform the role of Tomochichi. Just like we have the actor who today performs the role of Oglethorpe, well, they had both Oglethorpe and Tomochichi. And it makes you wonder on Georgia Day, maybe we need an actor to play Tomochichi as well, because that's what they did in 1883 down on the Savannah waterfront. You can see a steamship in the background and masts of a couple of other ships. And here they are reenacting the arrival of Oglethorpe. This is a photograph at the Georgia Historical Society, one of William Wilson's wonderful photos. And so thanks to the Georgia Historical Society for maintaining such wonderful records. And so in 1883, on the occasion of the sesquicentennial, the opportunity arose to put there was a lot of public interest in putting a new monument in Wright Square, where that mound had been built. And before the city, well, actually almost all the monuments in Savannah are the initiative of the private sector. Patriotic groups, ladies groups, different groups who would come forward and petition the city, Parks and Tree Department or the city's aldermen to say, city council, say, can we put up a monument to so-and-so on such and such a site? And the city would approve it, but it was up to that group to fundraise. So before anyone else came up with the idea of putting a monument in Wright Square, the Central Georgia Railroad Company came forward and said, we would like to have a monument to our company founder, William Washington Gordon, and who, the Central of Georgia was a huge part of Savannah by the 1880s. It was a driver of the economy, and Gordon was a celebrated part of that narrative, having founded the company 50 years earlier. So for their company, it was not only the 150th anniversary of Savannah, it was the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Central of Georgia. So they saw a doubly useful date to celebrate. They proposed this monument to Gordon, and Gordon's house was just a block away at Bull and Oglethorpe. So the house that Julian Gordon Low was born in was William Washington Gordon's house. So the monument was approved, but not everybody was happy. There was a letter to the editor from a man named Civis, so it was a pseudonym, who called on the city to instead erect a monument to Oglethorpe. And he said that a monumental column worthy of the dignified character of Oglethorpe to be placed within the original town and the line of fortifications on South Broad Street as he laid it out. In other words, this was one of the squares from the part of Savannah laid out by Oglethorpe. There wasn't a monument to Oglethorpe yet in Savannah, and in fact, I've always been puzzled. Why was it in the 19th century Oglethorpe was basically ignored? South Broad Street was only renamed Oglethorpe in the 20th century. The monument to Oglethorpe in Chippewa Square is around 1910. But the 19th century saw no interest in him. Other people, yes, like Pulaski and Sergeant Jasper and General Greene and William Washington Gordon. So what this fellow proposed was an obelisk to Oglethorpe. But interesting, he said, there too, within a few yards of that spot lie the remains of the aged Miko of the Yamacraw, evidently borrowing from Jones's book, the faithful friend of Oglethorpe. There should rise a modest shaft with the simple inscription, Tomochichi, Miko of the Yamacraw, faithful friend of Oglethorpe. So thus, within half an acre of, and this is this Civis writing this letter to the editor, he goes on to say, thus within the half acre of that square, familiar to both, would stand the memorials, visible to the eyes of every passerby, of the noble hero who founded our city, and to the no less noble Indian who with singular simplicity and faith welcomed him here and protected the infant life of his colony, two characters of which Savannah and Georgia ought never to lose the remembrance. Interestingly, Jones in that biography had, so implicit in this modest shaft to Tomochichi is 19th century attitudes towards natives. They were inferior. They were second, so he sees Oglethorpe as the founder of Georgia and Tomochichi as essentially a nice helper. And Jones, in that biography of 1868, even commented, from the very first, Tomochichi appears to have appreciated the fact of the superior power of the white race and the eventual triumph of the civilization which it enjoyed. So these kind of attitudes would put natives in a very second-tier kind of existence, would be perpetuated through the later 19th century. Meanwhile, though, there's this fascination with Tomochichi. So on the one hand, they're racist and they're sort of saying you're inferior. But they recognize the important role he played. And as this sort of growing anthropological and nationalistic interest in natives arrives, Tomochichi starts making more and more appearances in Savannah buildings and on streetscapes. And so in Scadd's Petter Hall, which was the original Savannah Volunteer Guards Armory, inside the officers' reception rooms is a room that was originally called the Tomochichi Club, and it's right over the front door. And the room has been beautifully restored by Scadd, and it was one of the officers' club rooms, and they named it in honor of Tomochichi. And over the mantle is this frieze, or this overmantle relief carving showing Tomochichi. Of course, it has a kind of headdress that would not have been worn by a Creek Indian. It's more of a Plains Indian feathered headdress. He's got a bow and arrow, and up above, higher in the room, is a tomahawk and a few other Native American weapons, and you see faces that wraps all the way around the room. So it's a fascinating simplification, stylized Native American iconography that's there to see if you're interested. So by the end of the 19th century, as Native Americans nationally had been dealt with, they were no longer a threat to American westward expansion. All the native lands had been essentially conquered, and the United States was becoming a pretty proud imperial power, and attitudes towards natives were changing. And locally, it would be the granddaughter of Gordon, of William Washington Gordon, who advocated, Eleanor Kinsey Gordon, advocated the erection of a monument to Tomochichi. One wonders if this idea that there's a realization Tomochichi was buried somewhere in this square. Here was this monument to her father or her grandfather. And so she organized the erection of this new monument. But interestingly, rather like reflecting those values of the period that treated natives not as of an equal standing and civilized in their own civilization, their own kind of culture, but rather uncivilized. And so how are they commemorating Tomochichi? But with this natural boulder. And this natural boulder is sort of like the natives themselves. It's uncarved, it's just this natural rock. And one wonders if anyone looks at it today and says, oh, that's a rather racist kind of monument, because it doesn't warrant the same kind of refinement that a typical monument would have, that they treat him as sort of just rough-hewn stone. And in fact is located in a very subordinate position within the square, off into one corner, barely visible from the middle of the square. As we move into the early 20th century, monuments to generic natives start appearing in the American landscape. And interestingly, attitudes towards older monuments. In the 1830s, a pair of statues were commissioned for the front steps of the Capitol building in Washington. That era when the Seminole Wars were going on, and these two sculptors, this one by Horatio Greenough, was commissioned in the 30s, completed in the 50s, installed, and depicted this white colonist basically disarming a kind of rabid native who is trying to attack his wife and child. And so this rather unflattering portrait of natives. And there's another statue that showed a Native American cowering at the feet of Columbus. And these two statues had stood there since the mid-19th century. But by the 1920s, Native groups started getting some political power. And in fact, in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. So Native Americans finally got citizenship in 1924, could start voting. And that empowered them, and they lobbied. It took them, they started lobbying in 1939, and it took until 1958 to remove these statues off the steps of the Capitol building. So the representations of natives have gone through all sorts of permutations, and the 19th century kind of putting down of natives evolves into recognizing them more and more. But meanwhile, here in Savannah, Tomochichi enjoys a rather remarkable reascension into the sort of local hierarchy of important Georgians and important Savannians. In 1933, this mural by William Hoffman, a local artist, was painted around the perimeter, the proscenium arch of the big theater in the middle of the high school on Bull Street. At one end is Oglethorpe, and at the other is Tomochichi, and in between are notable people in Georgia history like Button Gwinnett, Casimir Pulaski, Eli Whitney, and but interestingly, the two figures who are given pride of place are Tomochichi and Oglethorpe, and they're treated like equals. So you can see as we get into the 20th century, a shifting of attitudes has been taking hold after this Indian Citizenship Act, as well as just the lobbying efforts of natives. Within 15 years, roughly 20 years later, 1952, this plaque was erected in Wright Square, right in front of the Gordon Monument. When it became apparent, they realized, oh, right, that's where Tomochichi was buried. So they recognized it with a plaque. But what I find fascinating is this second sentence. He has been called a co-founder with Oglethorpe of Georgia. So you can see evidence, further evidence, that his status has further improved, that now he's on equal, between this painting and that plaque in the mid-20th century, Tomochichi has obviously ascended to a higher local rank. And on a status that frankly, I'm not aware of another Native American. I mean, there's Sacagaweas on the coin, and you get the odd Native American who might get some attention, but this level of local sort of honoring, he gets more than Oglethorpe. He had the Tomochichi Tourist Court. It was a motor lodge outside down in Kingsland, Georgia. Does anyone remember? So I found this very small resolution pamphlet, but there are postcards of this place, and they claim it was nationally known. That might be optimistic. It is a postcard after all, but there were a series of buildings, this motor court, but they named it the Chief Tomochichi Motor Court. And more recently, in fact, in 2005, this federal building was renamed the Tomochichi Federal Judicial Center, or more simply, Tomochichi Federal Building, but that was in 2005. So his status in the city is something that I've yet to see in anywhere else in American history. The honors that he received in the 1730s, there was a monument to him. I know of no other city that erected a monument to a Native American back in that era. But like with Native Americans generally, his reputation declined, he was forgotten, but he was resuscitated. And slowly, like the attitudes of his era, initially racist and subordinating him, but gradually his status grows by the mid-20th century. He's on equal footing with Oglethorpe. And a few years ago, there was talk locally of renaming the Talmadge Bridge. And one of the names proposed was the Tomochichi Bridge or the Tomochichi Oglethorpe Bridge. There'd be some relevance to that because the Talmadge Bridge, where it lands on the south shore of the Savannah River, just west of here, is those Indian lands. Back on that map, it's actually the old Creek Yamacraw Indian land that Tomochichi had occupied on day one when the colony was founded. So I wrote an article about 5 years ago or so on this, and it's online, and if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to send you the link if you're interested in reading the full version of this paper that sort of is accompanied by the journal article that I've published. So happy to send you a link. I've got cards at the front if you, we can pass them around, and please be, send me an email. So.
A question?
Sure.
So remember the suggestions about the bridge. Do you know of any suggestions about renaming streets for them?
I don't. I've never heard of a proposal to rename a street.
There's a square, there's two squares over the Hudson, one of Tomochichi square.
Oh, okay. And so on thank you. On Hutchison Island, there's a Tomochichi Square. Okay, good to know.
What's the other square?
Bryan Square.
Brian?
Square.
After the, Brian, yeah, Reverend Brian. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
I was wondering about the stone for Tomochichi that Nellie Kinsey Gordon, and she would have been Washington Gordon's
Right.
daughter-in-law, correct?
Yeah, I think I call her granddaughter, so daughter-in-law.
Daughter-in-law.
Okay, I apologize. The family relation is, so we'll get back there in a second. There it is.
And I know that Nellie Kinsey from Chicago had her father was involved with Native American relationships there, government,
Right.
which may have been
Helped encourage her to have a positive attitude towards.
spearhead this. And we always at Massey, when we talk about the stone, the children walk around it, and we were told that it came from Stone Mountain area.
Yes.
So
And the Central of Georgia essentially donated, or the stone company, the quarry donated it. It was transported for free on Central Georgia, but she insisted on paying for it and paid $1. Yeah, so that is not apocryphal. There are news reports about it. It's been well documented. So,
children love that story.
yes. But I would invite you, when you're taking children in front of this monument, and compare it to the Gordon Monument, and get them to
They don't like it. They're very angry. They're ready to storm.
when they see this.
They're ready to they're ready to storm the city. They want a statue. They're very angry.
Yeah. So they sense the
Oh,
implicit.
absolutely. Yep.
um,
From the second that you have to walk away from the center of the square, the kids are not happy at all. It's
Well, and let me see if I can find the quote.
offer things to teach them process.
So in the 1990s, I don't have a specific date, Tom Barton, in his role as editor of the Savannah Morning News, noted that the Gordon Monument, go back here a couple of slides, the Gordon Monument no doubt was considered classy when it was finished in 1883, but today it seems pretentious, and given what it replaced, sacrilegious. So he advocated, so he's part of that misperception, thinking that this monument destroyed Tomochichi's burial mound.
Yeah, I got a rude phone call yesterday asking that, he's a contractor that we use to do work on some of the monuments and stuff. Yeah, somebody approached him and asked him, what would it take to move the Gordon Monument to the Railroad Museum? He said they were going to petition
That
City Hall to move it.
Yeah, so what he proposed was excavating the chief's remains and reinterring them in a newly built Indian mound in one of the city's other squares. So first of all, Tomochichi probably had been removed from the site, because when they built this monument, they had to excavate foundations down into the ground, probably deeper than any grave would have been. And there was no comment in the paper of any body, any burial, any. This was 1883. The monument to Oglethorpe, to Tomochichi, was 1739. So it was almost 150 years later. And the monument, as I showed in the Cerveau view, the monument was gone by 1837, probably gone well before that. And my guess is, as attitudes towards natives between the French and Indian Wars, the Trail of Tears, I mean, there's so much friction with the natives that having this monument to a native in the middle of your city at a time when natives were, clearly not welcome and popular would have been Well, and but his bones, when they did tear down the pyramid of stone, they may well have disinterred him, and who knows, maybe they just threw the bones away. I mean, who knows what they did with them.
And there was already a pump too, right, before the Gordon Monument?
Well, the mound was on the site that I showed you in that old stereograph photograph. That was on this site, and that was from January 1872. And there was a well and a pump, and you see that in Cerveau view.
So there
That
could have been other things between the pyramid.
that would have upset the ground, and so this idea of reinterring Tomochichi's remains. I mean, who knows whatever happened. Steve?
Well, you hear the term mound versus monument versus gravestone. It sounds like you feel like Oglethorpe really truly intended it to be a monument.
Right.
But is it possible too that he knew, burial mounds were a part of Native American funeral traditions, that might have been part of it too. And also, we find, I think, that in the 18th century there wasn't as much appreciation for a grave or dressing up a grave or a cemetery, whereas in the 19th century, you have
Right.
traditions where they became parks and very elaborate tombstones. That was a pretty elaborate.
Yeah, well, and if we went back to the DeBram plan, which is right at the beginning of the talk, but on that plan, DeBram was the Surveyor General of the state of Georgia, or of the colony of Georgia. So he's a civil engineer. His drawings are accurate. He surveyed as much of Georgia as possible. And so one suspects when he put the sundial in Johnson Square, it's a circle. And we put the Tomochichi monument, grave, it's a square. So, if it were a mound, presumably it would have been circle. And he presumably would have drawn a circle if it were a circular mound, my guess. But he drew a square, and it's referred to as a pyramid. So, and in fact, previously, the one commentator in the colonial records refers to it as an obelisk. So it seems like it was closer to a monument than a burial mound.
That's what it reminded
Yeah.
me of, was an obelisk, and it's pretty obvious Oglethorpe had reasons to make it a monument.
Right.
How well they got along,
And-
how pivotal he was.
And obelisks don't always have to be really tall and slender. You can have quite squat pyramidal obelisks as well in the 18th century.
I'm wondering, as I looked at the, I forget the detailed painting of Savannah, and you zoomed into the Green Monument, it is showing a pointed top. That's missing today.
No, it's there. It's very subtle. It's exaggerated. That is steeper than, but there is. It's more like this. You can almost. I mean, you have to step way back, but it's very unusually shallow. But it is there. So these are the pumps that you were talking about. So what's surprising about this view is it doesn't. The other squares on Bull Street, and there would have been 4 of them by this point, Johnson and then Wright, Chippewa, and Madison, evidently only appear as pumps. And you don't see green space, which I've always wondered, why is that in this? I can't believe they didn't have any grass in those other squares like they did here. So it's possible there's an error in the painting, but this is Johnson Square, and then there are no other squares, but
It's Broughton Street.
so.
Intersection of Broughton and Scott.
So this might be Broughton. That would be Wright Square right there, and that would be here's Presbyterian, and that's Juliet Gordon Low birthplace. So that's Oglethorpe, and that would be Chippewa Square right there. So you have the pump in the intersections, and you have in the major intersections at Broughton, Oglethorpe, and Liberty eventually had and then this one is where Wright Square would be. So.
Well, you know what they say about the old Savannahans, they moved more after they died than before.
I haven't heard that. That's great. No.
A guy Market Tree Divisions at Bonaventure told me that.
Right. So the old colonial graves being moved to Bonaventure or Laurel Grove or yes.
So are we assuming or thinking that this granite monument was not chosen as a granite stone because they had a pile of stones honoring Tomochichi? Is that completely unrelated? That's one of the things that Massey tries really hard to appease our second graders by telling them that the stone was an intentional choice and that granite is very durable and strong, and leaders are very strong.
So can I make a comment?
Yeah, please.
Because I was reviewing some of the documentation we have on the monument in the city records, and there's
Okay.
a quote from when it was installed that says that they refer to it specifically as a boulder
Okay.
because they felt that helped to represent Tomochichi's quote strong and rugged character.
That's what we had always heard, and that is our saving grace. So we're gonna
And
follow that.
so that's their way of putting a positive spin.
No reference to the use of granite.
Right.
Or that
But
they
it's-
specifically used it as a
Or that they
replacement
knew
for
about the pile of
fair-
stones
yeah.
originally.
But it is a
Right.
Georgia stone,
But
so.
still,
Right,
It is,
and,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
that they took for it was a native material.
Yes.
Right. But the thing that I guess is, so trained as an art historian, this is sort of going deeper into my sort of education is how do we read things, and there's a field called semiotics, which is how you read signs and symbols. And sometimes the symbolic, there's the overt symbolic intent, meaning, oh, strong and rugged character. But then there's the what it says about you or your intentions that you might not have meant, like the kind of biases and prejudices that these people had, that this can become a symbol of that even if they didn't intend it overtly. So I think it can be used, as it sounds like you're doing, as a way to point to changing attitudes and the sort of the, because you've got the documentary record, the references to Tomochichi in these years is, he's clearly a second-class Native American. And the fact that they took real Native Americans and put them on in display cases at a World's Fair. And then I had a slide that unfortunately didn't make it into the version I've shown you, of an anthropological exhibit in Washington, D.C. from about 1901, and it showed dioramas of Native Americans. Like in the Natural History Museum, you have dioramas of animals and dinosaurs. They had dioramas of Native Americans in there as a way to show their clothing, and so that they saw them on a level with the mammals and the dinosaurs. So I think that's the context in which we have to understand this boulder.
It's a very natural reaction.
Yeah. Well, it's impressive that they react that way.
You mentioned Stone Mountain. Was Stone Mountain carved around the same time as this, or this is much earlier? Is that
Well, this is 1899, and Stone Mountain is early 20th century, or mid 20th century, because I believe the fellow who's in charge of Mount Rushmore was then hired to do Stone Mountain, if I remember correctly. So that'd be 1930s.
They overlapped a little.
Yeah. So, and Stone Mountain is only a fraction of what it was to be this massive frieze of.
right? But I was just
Yeah,
curious if
so
as
this
they're
is
carving
earlier.
That, they're like,
And-
let's use some of this for other monuments, but no,
Right.
it's completely unrelated.
Something hit me that I've never really paid attention to before, because we have a picture of one of those pyramid mounds in the center of the square to prevent the streetcar traffic. And of course, we misinterpreted it for the longest time, but
Oh, that's back here, I
that's
think.
not ballast stone, is it? It looks like it's too big to be ballast.
Yeah, it does. Let me see where that comes in. And it took me a long time, because these are just labeled. These are stereograph views from the Dennis collection at the New York Public Library, which is an amazing collection. And if you have copies, that's fantastic. But they will simply label them Bull Street. So I had to, I pieced out that this is the Sorrel Weed House, that arch on the side porch, and that's Oglethorpe Barracks right there. And it's kind of hard to see, but it looks like that's the other mound in the distance. But
Those are like large boulders.
yeah, this one really does look like large, and there are several of these photographs in this collection. They were a very popular item to photograph. And this one, and you can see Johnson Square in the background. So this is clearly Wright Square. And don't know what building that was, but it's, so yeah, so there was an article, and I go into quite a bit of detail in my article if you're happy to share the link with you. But there was an article in 1872 called The Mound Builders. and in the Savannah Morning News, and they talk about, they didn't mention why the mounds are being built, just that Alderman Farrell has advocated the building of 5 mounds in downtown Savannah Squares. And it passed City Council, and they started building mounds. But it was this separate issue that it's funny when you line things up on a timeline, how suddenly you go, oh, those two things are probably related. And so that's how I made that. I suspect. I found no categorical proof that that's why they built the mounds, but the timing and the fact that the goal was to put them in the middle of the squares at a time when streetcar tracks were coming through that they didn't want seems to be a logical explanation, because it probably only took a matter of a week or two to build one of these piles of stone, whereas commissioning a monument would take years to fund and carve, and so.
Well, you know, after the streetcars, the emergency fire and
Yeah.
ambulance
Kept going through the squares.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen photos of, and you can still in Oglethorpe Square in front of the Owens Thomas House, it's wide open, just a couple of little plantings at each side. You can easily imagine emergency vehicles going through the squares, but I doubt that will happen anytime in the future, but.
I can remember 1956 going in an ambulance through one of them
Wow.
and saying to my mother, oh, I always wanted to do that. And she said, shut up.
That's great. That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.